Thank you very much for the opportunity to speak on this very important issue. I'm also happy that this middle class report that the African Development Bank produced has really sparked a wide range of interest. So this is also, I think, what we wanted to engage in debates and to basically also influence policy, but on the other hand also for people to take us seriously about our work. When we started this project, as I said earlier in the meeting, we've talked a lot about poverty in Africa, and policymakers, development partners have been really deeply engaged on poverty reduction. However, when you look at the continuity from poverty reduction, where do you go next? I think people will have to move in the income ladder, in the wealth ladder, in the well-being ladder, either from being poor, the next step is maybe less poor, and then of course become middle class, and then etc. So our interest at the time was to draw attention to the little understood group of people who are agents of change, who are also source of dynamism, but never studied and understood how many they are, who they are, where do they live, urban, rural, and what profession, occupation they are. So we were inspired by this fact to change the narrative and also bring new discussion about the issue. Now, at the time, actually more or less I can say parallel to our report, the McKinsey group also published a report on the African middle class. I think it's in their series, Africa, the Lions on the Move. So these two reports came at the time when the African Renaissance narrative is widely spoken, from a hopeless continent to a hopeful continent. You know, the headlines have changed. So we have moved with the headlines to also say, look, Africa is not also a place everybody thinks it's propagates poverty, but also it propagates hope. And there are people who are making it, and it's growing and it's changing. I don't agree with the criticisms that the floating middle class is, when you add that, you get 30% overall middle class number, which a lot of people sense a chill to them, as you have heard. What kind of 30% number is that? The floating middle class is a bridge between the poor and the proper middle class. So these are households who are really in a kind of living condition. Neither they are poor nor middle class, but from year to year they change positions. Some of them may be even poor. In this analysis, we have not shown after that, after the report, we have tried to look at also the dynamics of middle class. If you start in the 1980 as a middle class, as a household, what is the chance that you remain a middle class in 2010? We computed that for African countries, and the picture is a bit mixed. One, a lot of poor people move to the middle class status, and those who started as a middle class also become poor. Especially we have taken the case of Ethiopia because we have real panel data. That means we have interviewed about 1,400 households repeatedly for 10 years. We visited them tenures, and asked them which economic group do you belong to. It's like a subjective measure. Are you poor, rich, or middle class? So the dynamics has been really changing rapidly. So much so that a large number of people who thought they were middle class in 1994 became poor in 2004. But also people who thought they were poor in 1994 became middle class and also rich. So it's important for policymakers to understand not only the size of the middle class, at least in the definition we have used, but also what does it take over time to keep them in that category or more, either they become upper class or whatever. So this report, in my view, is changing the narrative. So if you want African countries to become prosperous, 5% GDP growth is not enough. This is the conclusion, actually. You have to grow like China did in the last 30 years, like South Korea has done, like Japan has done. If you want to change in a generation the well-being of a country, you cannot do it with 5 and 4% GDP growth, because population is also growing rapidly in Africa. Yeah, after this report, which was based primarily on data we got from the World Bank on household consumption expenditure. So the definition of the middle class was based on people above $2 and less than $10 floating middle class, people above $10 and less than $20 as middle class, and then people above $20 as rich. Now, when you think of it, people may feel uneasy about this number. For instance, $20 a day, say in Paris, 20 euros a day, probably might mean nothing. How could you say a person is rich if he's 20 euros a day in a place like France? So people on this side of the world think it very ridiculous. But go to Africa, $20 a day is a whole lot more. You can pay your rent, you can pay your bills, you can raise your children. That is per person. So if you are a family of 5, $100 a day is a significant amount because it's in purchasing power. So when you convert dollars into local currency and you see the command it has over goods and services, it's not really an exaggeration. In some countries, university professors earn $200 a month when you convert it. But I mean, they get by. It doesn't mean they're on the street or they have a house, they have a car, they have decent, they raise their children. So the purchasing power concept is less understood in this definition. Now, after that, when we received also some criticism about this work, of course, the obvious step as a research agenda would be, why don't we use other indicators? So we moved to assets. So the assets would be more reliable than consumption or income, because you will be asking, it's like visiting somebody in their house and then trying to take a snapshot of how they live. You look around, if there is electricity, you say, oh, okay, this is not a bad place. If there are many rooms in the house, you say, oh, this is a household that tries to live comfortably, having different bedrooms, living rooms. And then you say, okay, if there are toilets, then if there is toilets, then that's good. If there is running water, that's good. If you see fridge around, that's good. If you see some radio, television, that's good. If you see people carrying telephone. So as you expand what the households own. At the time they were visited for interviews for the survey, it gives you an idea of which level of standard of living they live. It is also better than consumption because when interviewers go, they see it. And it's also easy for households to identify. But when you ask people how much you spent last week, most people, you know, in Africa, they don't keep records. They speak from memory. So sometimes they forget what things they have spent on. So you avoid those problems in the asset metrics. So we use that, but also we have tried to expand the definition of the middle class in terms of this asset and included from another data source what we call World Value Survey. This is an international think tank. They generate data by interviewing people all over the world about happiness, about trust, about social class, about status. So what they ask is they give you a list of social class. Upper class, upper middle class, lower middle class, working class, and poor. So for about 40 African countries, we collected that data and matched it with our estimate of a middle class. And it was amazing, as I showed the correlation between lower middle class and our measure of middle class was above 80%. So that gives some confidence that our estimate, which we processed from data that was at the household level, correspond with the data that was generated by a completely independent institution. So we feel justified by the numbers we have released about the status of the middle class, the size of the middle class, and in this subsequent work, we didn't also stop describing the middle class. We wanted to understand also what drives the size of the middle class. Why do you have higher in one country and lower middle class in another country? What are the most important factors? There, we were able to provide more information, like, for instance, the state of income inequality itself is a good explanation why you have a small middle class in some countries. Differences in the level of initial development, differences in the ethnic composition of a country. That probably some people may argue is not a good indicator, but it gives you some idea about how networks matter for mobility. You see, when you are ethnically divided, it means there is a language barrier, there is a cultural barrier, there is a norm barrier, and there is a trust deficit. So in our middle class estimation, trust, size of middle class, and ethnicity are highly correlated. In societies where you have high level of trust, there is low level of heterogeneity. That means they are more homogeneous in terms of tribes. And then the better it is also the size of the middle class. So these are the new extensions we have made since the release of that report, and they have been published in different journals. And our interest basically is Africa is a continent that's growing, but it's also a continent with widening inequality. So widening inequality means you have more poor people and then rich people. You have a small middle class. So this shrinking middle class is not good for stability of a country also, because you need at least a sense of aspiration for people to see the future. When you have two groups, extreme groups, for instance, very poor and very rich, So, you know, as a young generation, they don't see hope. Who am I going to be next? Either, you know, those poor and very tiny rich people. Therefore, there is a lot of frustration. But if you have a middle class, you know, who are not rich, who are not poor, usually when you ask people when they are young, they don't identify their aspiration with being rich. They want to identify in terms of occupation. I want to be a pilot, I want to be a doctor, I want to be a lawyer. That means they want to be a middle class.